أهلا وسهلا بجميع متابعي ومتابعات موقع صفر في هذه المقابلة مع المفكر الماركسي والكاتب والأستاذ الجامعي ديڤيد هارڤي. I really and genuinely want to thank you for all the work and effort you've been doing for all these years in trying to explain for us the works of Marx and then update this theory in many different areas.
Right.
So I want to start with a question that is discussed now in era, the neoliberal era.
Mm-hmm.
It's like 30, 40 years of more or less of the neoliberal version of capitalism.
Yeah.
And we are seeing changes and transformations around the world. The rising powers, declining other powers, heading to, I don't know, a lot of people talk about multipolar world, a lot of people talk about back to trade blocks and all that. Yeah. What do you think?
I think that capital actually occurs in many different forms, and clearly there's uneven geographical development. In some parts of the world you'll find, say, a merchant capitalist class and a landed capitalist class, hegemonic and no industrial class around, and then there'll be places where the industry is very strong. Marx himself, if you're reading Capital, was, I think, mainly focused on the Manchester industrial system. So in a sense his theory is a bit biased to that. So I think the problem we have is universalizing about things which are very radically different to different parts of the world. Now the whole kind of neoliberal era began with a crisis which was very much located in the, if you like, the then centers of capitalist accumulation, which were in the United States and Europe, and it was a crisis of wealth which was being extracted, if you like, from the very rich, and we even saw some modest redistributions of wealth in those countries towards the lower classes. And in the 1970s, the rich said that enough is enough, we want to do something different. So they switched entirely their politics and their policies. They found a theoretical justification in supply-side economics and all the rest of it, and the theory of austerity, which meant austerity for labor, communism for the rich, and all of those kinds of things. And there was a lot of unrest in the 1970s, mass unrest, and it was possible to construct a neoliberal turn which had a good deal of consent from the population, so that you look at Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and I may detest them, but they had a good deal of popular consent.
Okay.
But capital is always moving, always changing, always dramatically so. We have a very different ruling class now in the advanced capitalist countries.
Okay.
Back in the 1970s, it was largely still the large monopoly corporations, the automobile companies, the steel industry, the financiers, the Rockefellers, and all this kind of stuff. So you had a class configuration then, but now what we've seen is a reorganization of the economy, and the economy is now very much dominated by media, by finance, and so, you know, if you wanted to talk to important people in 1970, they're not the same people. They're not people like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk and people like that. I mean, we've got a different group of people now who are there. But what was true about neoliberalism all along was it was a political project to try to extract as much wealth as possible from what is going on in the world and concentrate it in the top 1 or 10%.
Okay.
That project is alive and well.
Okay.
So it is not over.
Okay.
It's just that it's no longer as legitimate, and everybody realizes that this is what is going on.
Okay.
It is, in fact, involving considerable shifts in the dynamics of capital. But there are two things about it which were all the way along significant. One was that the share of wages and national income should be cut down lower and lower and lower. And you see that going on.
It has been
everywhere, declining almost everywhere in the world. And the second thing is that technology should be about disempowering labor, and that technological change was about creating precarious, ephemeral jobs and so on. So the world in which you lived in 1960, where you would have a job as an auto worker when you're 30 and you would stay there till you're 60, forget it. That sort of world is over. People are going to have 4 or 5 jobs in their lifetime instead of just one. It's going to be precarious. They're also being told they have to look after their own pensions and their own health care and all those kinds of things.
That's more volatile.
It's more volatile.
Okay.
So neoliberalism, as we've experienced it, has changed its spots. But if you look and see what happened, for example, during the COVID period, there was a great deal of finance, state money injected into the system. Much of it went to the upper classes.
True.
A huge increase in billionaires, and the billionaires became triple billionaires and quadruple billionaires.
And now we're talking about the trillionaires.
Trillionaires.
Yeah.
So this idea of an increasing concentration of wealth and power in the upper classes is still there. It's just they're doing it very differently. And when I wrote the book about neoliberalism back in 2005, one of the things I was rather proud of kind of commenting was that I didn't think that neoliberalism was going to last without it becoming autocratic, militarized, and repressive. And of course, that's what has largely happened. You see that happening.
So it was born in crisis. Now, speaking of crises, we're witnessing, like, if we want to compare with the Great Recession in 2008 crisis, it was a crisis that started also in the center, in the US, and then it was transitory. It moved to other countries of Europe and Asia, everywhere. Now, currently, we're witnessing a phenomenon of a crisis, multiple crises in many different countries and regions around the world. In Asia, Sri Lanka, Lebanon, in Africa, Egypt and others, in Latin America, and different places, which makes it like more likely to say that there is some sort of connection between these crises.
But one of the things that happened after 1970s was that a large amount of money coming out of the Gulf states because of the oil thing got relocated to the United States investment banks, and it got lent around the world. And what you see in the 1980s is the formation of a debt crisis. In other words, right now we've got a debt crisis of Ghana, Sri Lanka, everywhere. Many countries are in debt. But actually that was going on in 1982 and 83. So that's something that is not new. It is something that was going on all the time. What was important about those crises back then is that they all remained localized. Political power kept them local. So the United States could talk sort of a few years ago about the period of the Great Moderation, because the United States was doing fine,
while other countries
were in serious crisis and resolving the debt crises. Mexico was twice sort of gone, and then the big one in Southeast Asia in 1997, 98. So the crises were there, and Latin America kept on going into a crisis, coming out. So that was one of the hallmarks of the neoliberal era, was that crises were constantly breaking out all over the place. What was special about 2000 and 2001 was the crisis started to affect the United States. And so the United States was having problems even before 9/11. The stock market had a big correction. The dot-com boom crashed, and there were all these things going on. So the United States was in difficulty.
Okay.
And it got out of it by actually doing, investing a lot in real estate and doing manufacturing a real estate boom. And so you got the housing boom. And then it crashes in 2007, 2008. And it's interesting, you kind of said, well, that was a crisis that went global. Well, that was deliberately done by the United States. In other words, the United States had a crisis.
Okay.
And like everything else, it could have been contained in the United States. But if that was then people in the United States were really going to suffer. So what the powers that be did was, by letting Lehman Brothers go bankrupt and all that kind of thing, it actually globalized the crisis, so that everybody deliberately. Oh, I'm sure it was deliberate. Okay. I'm sure it was. That then that meant that everybody had to sacrifice instead of just the United States.
Okay.
So this is what happened in 2007, 2008. Is it went global because the United States wanted it to go global. Okay. Before, if you look at what it had done in Southeast Asia in 1998, was it feared contagion, and it absolutely sort of walled off the crisis and said, just keep it located in Southeast and East Asia. And it successfully did that. But in 2007, 2008, it wasn't going to wall itself off.
Okay.
So the contagion, I think,
push it outside the walls.
Push it outside the walls and let everybody else bear some of the brunt of the crisis. Okay. And so, municipalities in Norway went bankrupt, and European banks had problems. Real problems were all over the place. But one of the big things that happened was, the one place it didn't go, actually there were several places it really didn't go very big. Even in Canada it didn't go very big. But one place it didn't go at all was in China.
Okay.
And China kind of basically said, okay, we're going to get out of this by our own expansion. And so you have this huge boom in China of investment in built environment, building high-speed rail networks, housing, new cities, all this kind of stuff. It was a huge kind of thing. And I think that China actually prevented the rest of the world going bankrupt.
Okay.
Very simply by the amount of demand that came out of China. So for instance, if you were supplying raw materials to China, like Chile was sending copper, then the tremendous demand for copper coming, and so Chile had a relatively light kind of experience. Australia, very light because they're providing all these raw materials. So those parts of the world that were sort of feeding the Chinese economy actually didn't experience too much of the crisis. Okay. So in fact you get a double thing, a serious crisis in the United States and an attempt to come out of it, but the attempt the United States had of sending it global and making the Chinese pay for it backfired, because the Chinese themselves found a way out of it. For instance, the crash of the US consumer market in 2008 meant a huge decrease of exports from China. Mm-hmm. So China should have gone into crisis, but China simply shifted all the work. All the work went.
This is a unique perspective.
It said, okay, we're not sharing this. We're going to do this, and by the way, start to establish ourselves as an alternative to the United States, so that a lot of Latin America now looks to China. And a lot of the world now looks to China, and so when we get all the stuff going on around Ukraine and China and attempts to push China into kind of some corner, most of the world is kind of sitting there saying we're with China.
Okay.
So this is what is
we're gonna go to that later.
Yeah.
But then, like, after all this. Let me ask, okay, so in economics classes, we learn about crisis as exogenous shock to the system, to capitalism. And then Marx is interested in the internal contradictions and the embedded crisis in capitalism itself. And, you know, Schumpeter has his nice term of creative destruction. How do you perceive crisis?
I think, well, there are crises that are exogenous and coming from outside. I mean, the COVID crisis, I mean, you can make an argument is inside, sort of, for various reasons, but for the most part, you would say something like that, and to some degree, even the climate change crisis, even though it's, you know, the product of what capital is doing, it's not something that's sort of internal to the logic of capital itself. So Marx is interested in endogenous crises and where they come from. And I think the way to look at this is you know, I mean, you can be very intricate about this and get to it, but I would basically argue something like this, that after 1951, when the United States went off the gold standard, this meant that
71, you mean?
71. 71
with Nixon.
Yes, they went off the gold standard, and after that, capital mobility could flow very easily around the world, and after that, the question of what is the numeraire, the basic form of value which is going to present, well, it was the US economy and the dollar. So that the dollar then became, if you like, the big, you know, stabilizer in the situation, but the US was controlling the great stabilizer, so it was getting a lot of its power from that fact. Now this then created all of these mini crises that I've mentioned around the place, because people were losing money and borrowing money and all, and so we started to find the power of the central banks became very much more significant. Like, okay, the central banks were important in the 1950s and 1960s, but nowhere near as important as they began to be after 1980.
Yeah.
And after that, we've had kind of, in a way, an international regime in which the central banks are big and very important players. Every time they had some difficulty, the central banks simply created more money. Now, what that meant was that in 1985 or something like that, they created money, but they didn't pull it all back.
Okay.
Then there's a crisis in 1987, create more money. Then, you know, so actually what they've been doing is creating money every time there's a crisis.
Okay.
So they just add zeros to the global money supply. So if you look at the graph of the global money supply after 1980, it just does this.
Yeah.
So that in effect means that the next crisis is going to be a financial crisis. So the odd thing is that we got into a crisis in 2008 over housing in the United States. We got out of it in 1988 through the construction of housing in China.
Oh, okay.
But both of those require finance. So mortgage finance and finance in China. So in both places, you suddenly find this incredible increase in financialization.
Okay.
So we now get financialization of the economy, which is really about that housing issue.
Okay. By the way, in this context, a lot of talking about in the US and outside of it about the debt of the US debt. It's 120% of GDP. I think it's hitting.
Yeah, that's right. No,
I don't want to ask about the burden. I want to ask about what functions does the debt serve? How does the US, as a superpower, as an economy, benefit from this huge debt?
I'm not sure it benefits from it.
Okay.
To begin with, I think the US calculation why it joined in the neoliberal game was that it would end up with huge surpluses and everywhere else would be indebted.
Okay.
That's what it imagined. It never imagined that it would end up indebted. In other words, and that's China's fault.
Okay, yeah.
That's China's fault.
Yeah. It's not their fault.
No, they made it. They made a miscalculation. They made a mistake. I think they.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, I think when they made that twist in the 1970s, 80s, and they started to globalize and open capital markets, they assumed that the strength of the U.S. economy was such, and the superiority of the U.S. industrial structure was such, that they would come out way ahead in terms of international balance of payment structures. But they didn't. But I mean, look at something like this. In the 1960s, the automobile industry in the United States was a monopoly structure.
Yes.
Yeah. In effect, oligopoly, because three companies. They opened up the whole thing, and by the 1980s, the German automobile industry is in here big time. The Japanese automobile industry is here big time. The Koreans are in here big time, and BMWs are being made in Alabama and all this kind of stuff. The United States never imagined that could happen. It thought it had the superior.
And this superiority is going to last.
And the superiority was going to last. And in fact, it was only superior in the 1960s because of capital controls.
Okay.
They took that down, and they suddenly found themselves, Detroit was in difficulty. Okay. Detroit was in having serious problems, whereas, all the European auto companies and so on were doing very well, and the Japanese and then the South Koreans and so on. So when I say it was a mistake, I don't believe that the policy planners in 1970s actually imagined that US would come out of this being hugely indebted.
Okay.
I think that was, and I think this is a problem now, very much a problem, because you're operating the reserve currencies and you're printing dollars like crazy. And actually, one of the things they might do, and I think this would be a very, very, very interesting move for them to make, is inflation, because one of the ways you can reduce the debt is to have huge inflation. So there may be sort of some thinking in the US right
ideas
now
to let
the inflation
back to double digit
run. Let the inflation run, because then that is going to sort of get rid of
of the debt and
get rid of the debt.
Yeah. By the way, similar thing you mentioned in your last session, last class, just like this about things going unexpectedly. That you were saying that the US was sending or helping, encouraging, not sending, technologies to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and so on to contain China.
Yes.
But now they find out that these technologies ended up in China, and now China itself is developing its own technology.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, no, and again, it's one of those things where they didn't recognize that in the what they thought was that by giving new technologies to Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, and all the rest of it, that they would actually put huge pressure on China, and that China would eventually fold in the face of the fact that China was not doing very well in terms of consumerism. Looked across the straits to Taiwan and saw a consumer economy. So the theory here was that the Chinese communism is going to fold.
Exactly.
In the face of that. What they didn't realize was that when China came into the economy, they had the labor force and that Japan did not have. And I remember being in Japan around 1980, and somebody said to me, "Our time is over." I said, "Why?" He said, "Everything's going to go into China."
Okay.
Including all the technologies that the US have passed to Japan.
Okay. So, and why did you say that? Why did you see that happening?
Well, I didn't see it happening. It's just somebody said it to me when I was in Japan. I was surprised, but then I thought about it, and I thought, yeah, well, I can see, because Japan's demographics are very bad. It's not strong population growth. Their labor force is not anywhere near as sophisticated as the Chinese, and the Chinese, all the big Chinese corporations immediately went into China, taking the technology with them, and so the United States kind of couldn't stop that.
Okay, let's move now from the industrialized economies to economies and countries that are not much industrialized. And thus they have a very weak industrial working class, which is a thing that has different implications on so many levels. You sometimes hear people talking about there's no capitalism in these economies, or that the path to development and progress is to build capitalism from scratch. And therefore there's no class struggle, and there's no surplus being produced. What do you think about that?
Well, I think I would approach the question rather differently. I mean, we've had a lot of deindustrialization in the United States and Europe. Where is the industrial working class right now? Well, it's just in places like Bangladesh and China.
Southeast Asia, yeah.
Yes, very much that. But the interesting thing there is, it used to be believed, and to some degree was the case, that industrialization meant the concentration of considerable wealth. I don't believe that Bangladesh, for example, is a very rich country, right? Even though it's strongly industrialized. So industrialization doesn't actually lead to the tremendous concentrations of wealth, which was the case in the Manchester system that Marx was looking at. In other circumstances, you find that the class structure is such as to inhibit the full development of capital. I mean, you get something like Clyde Woods talked about something called arrested development. And you find examples of arrested development all around the place, because the power of the landowners, or the power of the merchants, or the power of the resource owners and rentiers and so on is such as to block the actual full development of industrial capitalism. So you will find many situations of that kind. And of course you will find places where war, I mean, if you're looking at Yemen or something like that, then clearly this is another situation where the class structure is what you have is a sort of a clan.
Exactly, tribal.
And that's even true in places like Nigeria and so on, so that you will find so I would want to look first of all at the nature of the class structure, and then say what kind of economy is possible here. And you find a lot of examples of arrested development. Interestingly, you find this even within the United States. I mean, if you looked at an entity like Puerto Rico, is a great case of arrested development. It attempted industrialization, but when the US withdrew the subsidies, then that all disappeared. A lot of it disappeared. So you will get arrested development, and then you will get the effects of wars, and actually landed capital and what might be called the rentier capital can move in. I mean, Lebanon would be an interesting kind of case. I mean, it's been destroyed twice. But I do remember in 2008 or 9, I was in Lebanon, and it seemed to me it was booming. And I said, well, why is this? I said, well, we're rebuilding from the last war. And we've got all this money which is coming from Europe and everything else. Of course, and then a lot of that is stolen by the rentiers, and you get the corruption and all this kind of stuff. And then it gets destroyed again, and then...
by the way, this is a perfect introduction to then my next question. Because in case of Lebanon, we see you talk about the concept of accumulation by dispossession. And that exploitation does not only take place in factories and where surplus and commodities are produced. It also takes place in the fields and areas where the surplus is realized, where commodities are consumed. Yeah, Lebanon is a very good case about accumulation by dispossession.
Yes.
I want you to elaborate on these two concepts.
Accumulation by dispossession seemed to me to be very much more prominent during the neoliberal period.
Mm-hmm.
That what you were doing was you were privatizing public assets, and in the process of privatizing, you almost invariably opened up the possibility for somebody to become a monopolist. Mm-hmm. and extract. For example, somebody like Carlos Slim gets hold of the telecommunication structures in Mexico and becomes one of the world's
fellow Lebanese origin from Lebanese origins. Yeah.
And you find this sort of thing going on pretty much all over the place. So that again, this is the extraction of wealth from people's pockets, and often in small amounts from people's pockets. So that, for instance, if you're in telecommunications. Mm. People are using it maybe just a little bit, but if you tax it and price it right, then you get a little bit of everything. But there's a mass of utilization. So that I started to think, well, more and more we're seeing the billionaire class in the world is becoming billionaires because they're extracting wealth rather than making it. Okay. For instance, in this country, there are about 7 or 8 million households who lost their housing, and then it gets taken up by Blackstone
in 2008.
And afterwards, the banks are all holding this stuff, and Blackstone goes to them and borrows money and pays for all of these mortgages, which are worth maybe $500,000, but they pay $100,000, so they get a huge. So Blackstone has now become one of the biggest companies in the world, one of the biggest landlords in the world, and a great supporter of Donald Trump and all the rest of it. So Blackstone is an operation which is about taking assets. And so you kind of say, the black population in the United States lost about 70 or 80% of its asset wealth. Because it's in housing, they lost their houses, and Blackstone got it. So in a sense, what you did was you transferred wealth from marginalized and not very affluent black populations and Hispanic populations and women with single-headed households, from all of those people who lost their houses. You extracted wealth from them, and Blackstone procured it. Then what happened to the banks that gave them the mortgages at a very cheap rate? The government came in and said, we will cover the difference between what you got from Blackstone and what you would have got if it had been a proper market. So everything was about fixing all this. Well, this is all a racket, if you like.
Exactly.
It was a scam. But it ended up with Steven Schwarzman becoming one of the richest people in the world very quickly in 2 or 3 years. And 2 years ago, he gave about $150 million to MIT and Oxford University to study the humanities.
Okay. So it's as if this is more like a cyclical and periodic primitive accumulation.
Yes.
It's an ongoing, cyclical process of primitive accumulation.
The reason I didn't want to call it primitive accumulation was because in Marx, primitive accumulation is about the creation of a working class by dispossessing them and putting them across pushing them off the land. So primitive accumulation, it seemed to me, was about the formation of a working class. We have a situation in 2008 where the working class is already formed. They're already working. Exactly. What you're doing is you're taking away asset wealth, which has been. So that's the reason I wanted to use accumulation by dispossession rather than primitive accumulation.
Okay, with such ways of accumulation rather than the classic industrial production and accumulation there, as we said, you have a weak industrial working class, and then for people in these societies, should they look for different classes or social groups that are being, subject to these mechanisms of accumulation in order to undertake this struggle against capital and to move to a certain alternative?
Yeah, I really don't like the idea of telling people what they should do.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, this is
fair enough.
What I can do is to say, look, there's a situation here, and then in a way, if you want to know what the situation is, I can try and help you understand it. Then it's up to you what you do.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what we were looking for.
But I will go to the point of saying, even within the United States, it's absolutely critical that we start to build alliances between people who are employed in industry, people who are employed in services, people who are engaging in struggles over housing rights and healthcare and education. In other words, what I would like to see is a kind of an awareness of the fact that capital is actually implicated in all aspects of daily life. Mm-hmm. And that to the degree that people are alienated and feel alienated, then you would hope that instead of blaming, racial discrimination or something like that, they will kind of look at the situation and say, well, we need to put all of these things together and have a better understanding of how capital works.
Okay, another thing relevant to places like Lebanon or even here in the US is the credit system.
Yes.
And the credit system does a specific job for the capitalist, which is collapsing time. The capitalist does not want to wait for the time between producing the surplus and realize and the time it has been realized for him to get back to production. Marx says it is a necessary tendency of capital is therefore circulation without circulation time. So the capitalist wants the circulation for him to move and go, but he doesn't want to wait. Also, another thing Marx says in the Grundrisse, very interesting, is that money then, insofar as it now already in itself exists as capital, is therefore simply a claim on future or new labor.
Right.
He also says, I'm going to skip a few lines, like the creditor of the state, every capitalist with his newly gained value possesses a claim on future labor, and by means of the appropriation of ongoing labor has already at the same time appropriated future labor. For example, in cases of Lebanon, I go back to Lebanon, creditors of state are not only extracting and appropriating the current labor, the labor of the people living now, they are also appropriating the labor of their kids and their grandkids, their future labor. So what do you think about this?
Well, I mean, I think the whole kind of theory of the credit system is very important to look at, and I'm not saying that I have it completely sorted out, because it's a very complicated thing. But one of the things that I think Marx makes very clear is that the credit system is not a parasitic form. It can take parasitic forms, but it is absolutely essential for the dynamics of capital that you have a credit system which can deal with long-term fixed capital investment, housing finance over 30 years, all those kinds of things. So it does have a very important role to play, and this is again why I think it's important to emphasize some of the positive aspects of the credit system, because that then legitimizes some of the other stuff that goes on. And he has a wonderful phrase about how this was going on in Paris in the Second Empire. There was two bankers there, the Pereira brothers.
Yeah.
And he said they had the delightful character of swindler and prophet. Profit because they're prophesying what future labor is going to have to be about. Okay. So it synthesizes the argument you've just made, and I think that argument is very, very strong, and then you find, of course, to the degree that there is a claim upon future labor, that future labor is indebted and is in a condition of debt peonage. So what you find is that large segments of the population are just sitting there and recognizing that, you know, for instance, student loans in this country are a classic example of that. And they're going to, you know, people are committed and they have to spend the first 10, 15 years of their working life working off
just to pay back the debt.
Pay back the debt. So I think that this argument about, you know, there's a claim upon future labor, you see that from the standpoint of capital, but then you see who is indebted and who is caught there.
You have a nice sentence that you said, I think, in one of the classes. If you are anti-capitalist, you have to control the credit system.
Yes, absolutely.
you have to be in control of the banks and other.
Yeah, I know, and it's interesting. You know, even sometimes the theorists of capital in the Financial Times say, you know, banks should really be a public utility and be regulated like public utilities. But then it turns out that the real moneymaker for banks is, of course, mergers and acquisitions. Yeah. They don't get much out of retail banking. I mean, they get a certain amount, but that's the quiet stuff. The big stuff is mergers and acquisitions and all kinds of games like that.
Okay, let's move to technology and AI. And I've been attending your course, your class on Marx's Grundrisse. And also we can show your book, a companion, which really helps. Like, I cannot see myself reading the Grundrisse itself. Yeah. Thank you for doing this effort for us. Yeah. And in the Grundrisse, Marx now talks about some sort of automation of the role of machinery, the prevailing role of fixed capital, and so on. Let's begin with this. We see now people's personal properties, like their cars, are being transformed into capital with Uber, Lyft, and so on. Yes. Their houses with Airbnb and you know, working remotely and working from home. Right. What does this tell us about capital accumulation and capitalism now?
Well, it's interesting. Take Airbnb. Yeah. It starts out as something which is, you know, maybe helpful for individuals.
True.
You know, it starts out. Then it becomes big business. And the same with Uber. You know, Uber gets capitalized. Again and again, we find something that is maybe to the benefit of the small-time operator and helps out, gets turned into something which is to the benefit of big capital. Okay. And we see the capitalization of the process. So this is one of the things that is very striking about the present moment, that it's almost impossible for anybody to do anything without it at some point or other being appropriated. Mm-hmm. And that's why I come back again to this kind of accumulation by dispossession, because what in effect you're doing is bringing all those Airbnbs into some big configuration, so it looks like it's just, you know, somebody renting the back room for a few weeks, and it's not that at all. It's so now you've got the, you know, whole cities like Barcelona saying, we have to control this, and you can't turn this into sort of a big capital, and so there's a big struggle going on over that.
Okay. In the Grundrisse, Marx says, the transformation of the production process from the simple labor process into a scientific process appears as a quality of fixed capital in contrast to living labor. So we see more and more of this if we may use the term, substitution between labor and fixed capital, machinery, and so on, especially now with AI and now recently GPT and so on, and the prospects of it. First, I want to ask about the effect, the effect of these technologies on the working class, on labor, and on people in general. Like a poll, the results of a poll of, like, I think it was last week, it showed that 56% of Americans believe that college degree is not worth the cost anymore. So what do these technologies have, of effects on working class, in de-skilling them? And
I'll give the classic Marxist answer to that, which is, the technology in itself can do all kinds of things and may be available for all kinds of things. The important question to ask is not about the technology, but how that technology is going to be used.
Okay.
And then I ask the question, how do you imagine that capital will use AI? What will it do with it? As opposed to, how would a socialist use AI? And if you put it that way, then you see immediately that to the degree that capital is going to control the use, it's going to use it for capital's benefit.
Okay.
Whereas the socialist will want to use it for social benefit, and for socialist reasons. So one of the big questions we have to ask of AI is precisely what is capital likely to do with this? And the answer is, given the model of what happened with automation and all the rest of it in industry and so on, it will be used to destroy class power. It will be used to render labor more and more marginalized and disposable. So it will be used in all these kinds of ways. And it will be used to empower the capitalist class. And it's an accumulation of more and more wealth at the expense of the mass of the population. So that's what it's going to be used for if it's left open to capital. The social use, and there'll be some people in the middle, from the middle class, who will kind of say, well, it's not good that it gets used that way to crush workers even more than they've been crushed by neoliberal practices. There'll be some people in the middle who are kind of going, but the other side of it is, okay, how would we use it as socialists? And I think the answer would be, we would use it in such a way as to maximize our free time. And Marx has an interesting kind of comment about that. He says, when you look at a thing it releases a lot of free time. The thing is that capital turns the laborer's free time into surplus value. That's what they're interested in doing, and that's what they're going to do. Whereas a socialist society, you would want people just to have free time and do what they damn please, whatever.
Exactly. But okay, to what extent can this go? Like, we were discussing how labor theory of value itself is threatened, is in jeopardy, while the power of the capitalist class is not in jeopardy, with the rise when value is being transformed from labor to capital.
Again, the labor theory of value is a very tricky kind of question to get into. If the labor theory of value is simply about the value of an object or a value of a service, something of that kind, if it's simply about that, then you have a certain kind of, that's all going to disappear, because the labor input into a lot of these things, like the services and so on, is going to be zero. But I think the labor theory of value was more than that.
Okay.
It's about the life of the laborer and the qualities of life of the laborer. So at the end of the day, what the labor theory of value is supposed to explain is why the condition of labor is such that those who do the work receive so little benefit from it.
Okay.
So that's what it seems to me the labor theory of value is really doing. Now I'm adjusting a lot of the accounts of the labour theory of value, but if you take it, one way, just simply as how much labour is congealed in a product or so on, then and if the answer is 0, then the labour theory of value is not very helpful. But if you turn it into, why is it that the people who are making this stuff or caught up with this stuff end up living in shacks and peasant huts and all that kind of stuff and get almost nothing out of the work they do, then it seems to me that you have a different idea of the labour theory of value, which is, I think, what Marx was working towards.
Okay, this very last problem, ideas like universal basic income are discussed. Do you think that this is enough to tackle this issue?
I don't think so, but again, that's because I take this view of the totality, and if you have a universal basic income, what's to stop all the landlords raising rents so that you're no better off?
Okay. Yeah.
Huh?
Nothing.
Yeah. And in fact, I'm sure there are lots of landlords around who are very happy about the universal basic income. Then, okay, good, I can raise the rents.
Okay. Last thing on socialism. Few points. Commenting on one of the points you raised, Marx says, just as capital on one side creates surplus labor is at the same time equally the presupposition of the existence of capital. And he says the whole development of wealth rests on the creation of disposable time.
Yes.
So, and you comment on that as Marx is praising free time for all as the true measure of how far we had progressed towards socialism.
Yes.
That's cool.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah,
it takes it to the very essence of things.
Well, he has this wonderful kind of comment about, the realm of freedom begins when the realm of necessity is left behind. Mm-hmm. So if we can automate and do that, the realm of necessity, so that we only spend 2 or 3 hours a week doing the things we have to do to get everything, then the rest of the time,
that's the liberation of the individual.
Yeah. And it's but you see, there's a moral thing here. It's very strange. In anthropology, people would find various social groups, and they would work for about 3 hours in a day, and after they'd done 3 hours, they would sit down and talk and socialize. And Western industrialists came and looked at these people and said, this is impossible, they're so lazy, they're so terribly blah blah blah, it's immoral that they do this,
Yeah.
But of course that's not consistent with a 12-hour day, and we find people now working 80-hour weeks because they have 2 jobs, and they have to have 2 jobs in order to get enough income to survive. So what we're seeing is a world which is very, very far from this ideal thing.
That's true. Okay, you say that socialism has to be constructed out of the remnants of what we have now. And that if we want everyone to have cell phones in a socialist society, how will we organize the division of labor in such a way that the labor to produce them is gratifying and non-exploitative? What do you mean by non-exploitative labor?
I mean where there is no capitalist in the system who is expropriating the surplus value. I imagine that we could think of a huge kind of collective like Mondragon or something like that, where the remuneration of all of the workers is tightly controlled, so the disparity between the highest paid and the lowest paid is no more than 3 to 1, instead of what we now see, which is 350 or 400 to 1. In corporations. So we would I mean, clearly we would have a complicated world if we want to have computers and cell phones and things like that. We need to keep the structures of production probably intact, but the rates of remuneration would have to look very, very different. And the side benefits and so on, healthcare and all those sorts of things be totally socialized, and access to housing totally egalitarianized, if you want to call it that.
David Harvey, my very last question. What does it mean to be socialist in 2023?
I think it means to be acutely aware of all those ways in which capital is dominating all our aspects of daily life and culture, and to press for some sort of alternative freedom where we can discuss and think about something radically different from that which is put on the table by capital.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.